Hello, and welcome to another instalment of the Words Ireland lecture series, delivered by writers for writers on writing. There are 6 lectures in this series, with a new one made available each Tuesday between the 27th of October and 1st of December 2020. You can view each lecture at Volta.ie or on Words Ireland's YouTube channel. This particular lecture is delivered in partnership with the Society of Authors. My name is Paul Murray. I've written 3 novels, but more recently I wrote a script for a film called Metal Heart, which came out in the summer of 2019. I thought I might talk a little bit about how that came about and what it was like going from writing a novel to writing a script, the differences in the processes, what I learned from the experience and how it changed my approach when I went back to writing books. I'd always watched a lot of films and I'd always been interested in writing for the screen. In fact, when I was in school, that's what I wanted to do. Films felt relevant to me in a way that books did not. They were modern and transgressive. I started by writing highly derivative Monty Python type sketches. Then when Twin Peaks came out, I turned to highly derivative David Lynch type scripts with a lot of dwarves and amputees. Later, during the wave of gifted young American filmmakers like Richard Linklater, Whit Stillman, Steven Soderbergh and Gus Van Sant, I wrote impassioned screenplays about characters having monosyllabic but profound conversations while hitchhiking along the freeway past endless fields of waving corn. It bothered me even then that I'd never been on the freeway. More practically, I had no idea how I might even begin to get any of these scripts made. Even today, in the midst of COVID, it's hard to appreciate how inert Ireland felt in the 80s and early 90s, and how impossible it seemed ever to do anything interesting. I did seriously consider moving to America, and when I started writing fiction in college, it was initially as a substitute for the films I wished I could make. It seemed like a lonelier, less romantic pursuit, but it had the advantage that you didn't need anybody's help, and it didn't matter whether you lived in LA or Ballybrack. I did a master's in creative writing, but I was still interested in exploring the film world. In 2003, my first novel was published, and I was asked if I wanted to write the script of an adaptation, which in retrospect would have been a great way to learn about screenwriting. But I said no, mostly because I'd spent so long working on the book that I couldn't bear the idea of going back into it. But also because I assumed there'd be loads of opportunities. Books, screenplays, they were all writing, weren't they? As time went by, I discovered that there was not, in fact, much crossover between the writing world and the film world. Instead, the relationship seemed to be quite adversarial. On the one hand, you had writers unhappy with the adaptations of their novels. Louis de Berniers famously said that having your book made into a film was like sending your child to school, and when they come home, their ears are on backwards. Then you had writers who were unhappy with the films of their screenplays. The novelist Jane Harris has described her script about 4 40-something men getting divorced being turned into a film about 4 20-something men getting engaged. Walter Hill, who wrote Aliens as well as writing and directing 48 Hours and The Driver, said that the screenplay is the only art form seen exclusively by the people who will destroy it. I heard these stories, and I could appreciate that looked at one way, writing a script would be a serious demotion for a novelist. As a novelist, you're the sole ruler of the world you've created. It's a major concession to hand the reins over to someone else. Not only that, but screenwriters rarely get any credit. Think of your favourite films and see if you know the name of anyone who wrote the script. But still, weren't these cavils ultimately about ego? Yes, there were sacrifices involved, but it wasn't worth it to make a film. If I ever found myself writing a screenplay, I resolved that I would abjure my ego and do what was asked of me without complaint. Then, in July 2010, I went to see my friend Stephen Swift in a play called Arcadia at the Gate Theatre. Stephen was a brilliant actor who passed away tragically a couple of years ago. Also appearing in the play was the actor Hugh O'Connor. I'd never met him before, but I'd seen him in films like My Left Foot, Young Poisoner's Handbook, any number of other films. After the play, I got talking to Hugh. He read my book, Skippy Dies, and he liked it. He told me he was interested in going from acting to directing. I said I was interested in writing a script. He asked me if I wanted to apply for a development grant together. Back then, the Irish Film Board offered a bursary for screenwriters. I believe they've changed it since, but at that point, you could get up to €12,000 to work in your script. And I heard there were writers who'd lived for years in these bursaries, working on scripts that were never and possibly could never be finished. If we got the bursary, it'd mean that I could work on a script full-time for 6 months or however long it took without it being a major blow, if, as was likely, it didn't get picked up. I knew that it was very, very difficult to get a film made. Salman Rushdie, in an essay on the many attempts at adapting Midnight's Children, puts the failure rate of films at around 99%, the vast amount of film projects never going to production. From that point of view, I went into the process with my eyes open, but I didn't give a huge amount of consideration to the writing itself. I'd written a play in college, and I'd imagined it would be similar to that, which is to say, a story told in dialogue. The first inkling I had that that mightn't be the case came with the bursary application. The film board didn't want a draft of the script, or even a partial of the script. They just wanted a 10-page treatment. Tell us what your film was about, they were asking effectively. This might seem like an obvious place to start the conversation, but I was thrown. How was I supposed to describe a film that didn't exist yet? I asked Hugh if there'd been some mistake, and he explained that this was how screenwriters usually worked. They'd come up with the basic idea, then they'd expand that into the basic story and the story into a treatment. If a production company took an interest, they would then divide the treatment up into 3 acts and the acts into scenes. They'd stick a post-it on the wall for every scene. Once there are 70 scenes, they'd have enough for a movie. Only when all that had been done would they even think of writing the dialogue. I found this totally mystifying, not to say barbaric. I'd always written my way into my books. I didn't map out a story beforehand. Instead, I'd have some kind of a seed, usually something incredibly throwaway, hardly even describable as an idea, a line or an image or a joke or a situation or even just a name. Most of these would never come to anything, but others, when I wrote them down, would generate other lines, other images, other jokes and situations, and there would be this incredibly exciting period where, as I wrote, all of the ideas for characters and plot would be coming to me at the same time, as if from some other dimension, and I'd realize I had the beginnings of a novel. But I needed to be writing for that process to happen, for the story to reveal itself. Ted Hughes talks about the page as a window. You're trying to see through it into the world that you're describing. Writing is what makes the page transparent, so you can experience the scene directly, as later, hopefully, the reader will experience it. Coming up with the story without looking through that window seemed like working in the dark. I could come up with the basic plot, but I felt like I wouldn't have any sense of who the characters were or why they were doing any of it. Obviously, the wise man here, instead of assuming that the entire film industry had been doing it wrong for all this time, would have just knuckled down and written the treatment. But I didn't want to betray my artistic principles, so I decided what I'd do was write the script first and then write the proposal for it, which I thought was very clever. If I was writing the screenplay of my screenplay writing experience, this would be the key scene where I make the tragic mistake that will bring about my fall. But it seemed to work at first. I had the most important thing already, the seed. Hugh and I had talked about what the film might be about. Hugh's pitch was teenagers. Teenagers are a staple of cinema. I'd spent 7 years writing a book about teenage boys, however, and I thought that well was dry. This time, I thought I might write about girls. I'd recently read a graphic novel called Black Hole, and I wanted to do something like that, something that would be spooky and strange, but also funny and also a love story. The image that came into my head was of a girl lying in a bath. Her hair is dark, her expression is mournful, the mood is tenebrous. In voiceover, she recites a list of bleak words, the void, the emptiness, the nothingness. Her sister, who's not a goth, who's pretty and blonde, appears on the landing and starts banging on the door. "Emma, are you in there? What are you doing?" Emma doesn't reply. Her sister is agitated. We begin to fear the worst. Then her sister says, "It's Saturday night. I'm going out. I need to use the bathroom. How long are you planning to stay in there?" Again, Emma doesn't reply. As her sister storms off, she just smiles to herself, a smile that says, "Mission accomplished." That was the central relationship of the film right there. 2 sisters who don't get on. One confident and outgoing, the other inward and dark. Though literally every other aspect of the script changed over the next 5 years, that image always remained right there at the start. The 2 girls on either side of the bathroom door, the goth and the preppy. I'm ashamed to say that for all my interest in cinema, up until that point, I'd never seen an actual film script. But I'd seen hundreds of films, so I thought I knew how they worked. My understanding was that a script was basically a novel with everything taken out except the dialogue. I like writing dialogue, and the whole thing seemed to go very quickly. A scene that in a novel might take me 2 days to write could be done in 10 minutes. It was a revelation. I'd always written long, complicated books that took years to complete. Now I had an entire narrative with characters and conflict, with a beginning, middle, and an end in a couple of weeks. I wrote the treatment and submitted it to the film board. We got the bursary. Everything was going incredibly well, and when I met my writer friends, grinding along with their novels, I couldn't help feeling an amount of pity. It's like watching someone plough a field with some olden days type animal, like an ox. Why would you put yourself through that? Who in the modern world even knew what an ox was? Get a tractor, dude. I made some changes to the script based on the initial notes, and a few weeks later, the film board asked us to come in and meet with them. As a writer, you don't interact a huge amount with anybody off the page. Nobody really cares what kind of a person you are. But in the film world, there are a lot of meetings, and these meetings matter. It's a collaborative medium, and if you're obviously a psycho or a massive asshole, no one will be rushing to work with you. Conversely, there are some very famous but self-evidently untalented filmmakers that have built serious careers by being, as the phrase goes, good in the room. The IFB people were very nice and helpful. Basically, their take was that while the script needed more work, it had features that made it attractive. It was mostly set in the Dublin suburbs, so it would be cheap to make. The protagonists were teenagers, so it would be a place to introduce new actors, and it had a chance of reaching a wide audience. Again, for me, this seemingly innocuous statement set off alarm bells. As a writer, I've always felt it's very important not to think of your audience because of the danger that you'll start trying to please them and stop seeing through that window and immersing yourself in the world you're creating. Plus, no one can tell what an audience will want. All you can do is write the best book you can and hope that someone somewhere will be into it. Don DeLillo, when asked about his imaginary reader, said he pictured a guy living on his own in a cabin in the woods whose life hadn't panned out like he'd expected. In a film, that's a luxury you can't afford. Even a low-budget indie film is, compared to a book, really expensive to make. It has to look like it's going to pay for itself. If your investors don't think anyone's going to go and see it, then even if your script is a masterpiece, you won't get the green light. The film board also noticed that I'd written my script in Microsoft Word. In the film world, this is like submitting your novel, handwritten in green ink. They gently suggested I use a screenwriting program. They thought that would help me address the structural issues. So the first thing I did was get Final Draft, which is the program the whole industry uses to write and develop scripts, from first draft all the way through to shooting, which automatically puts your script into the proper format. As for structural issues, I didn't know what they meant. I thought structure was just a fancy way of saying plot. Laurie Moore tells a funny story about being on a panel with Miranda July on structure. When it came time for Miranda July to speak, she stood up and started singing. Laurie Moore took this as proof of the lengths to which writers will go not to talk about narrative structure. There were more to's and fro's, meetings and rewrites. I was working on the script in between drafts of a novel, so it was going in slow motion. Finally, though, we got a second round of funding to develop the script. At that point, the second round, the IFB assigns a production company to work with you. We were paired with Treasure Films. Treasure had made I Went Down, probably my favourite ever Irish film, as well as The Stag, which Hugh had acted in, Viva, and a whole lot of other very good films. By that point, I'd finally completed my third novel, and I was going through that period of bereavement when you miss your book, but you can't bear to think about starting a new one. It was the perfect time to start working in earnest on a screenplay. We began to have meetings about the script. These were very different to the meetings I'd had up to now, just with Hugh, where we'd talk about what music we'd like to use or put together a mood board, and the meetings with the IFB, where they'd gently nudge us in one direction or another. Making films was what Treasure did. They had a particular take on the script, a particular outcome in mind. They were aiming for the film that the IFB said might have an audience, and their focus from the start was on those audience-reaching aspects of the script, pushing those up while dialing down the other, weirder, audience-unfriendly aspects. The script was taken apart and every element of it examined. All kinds of problems emerged. Some of these problems I'd anticipated. Translating my Word document into Final Draft, I saw that my script was 150 pages long. Bearing in mind that a page of script equals roughly a minute of screen time, this meant that my coming-of-age comedy drama was longer than the director's cut of Apocalypse Now. Film producers are obsessed with time, and not in a Marcel Proust way. They want to keep the film as short as possible. There are commercial reasons for this. The shorter a film is, the more screenings cinemas can have in a day, but they also think the tighter a film is, the better it works. A similar attitude prevailed in American fiction in the 1980s, when Gordon Lish was chopping up Raymond Carver. Some people still believe that boiled-down prose is the pinnacle of literature. I've always been skeptical about relentlessly paring things back. If you're producing an artwork for an audience, surely it's with the hope that on some level they'll want it, like that their main priority isn't just to get it over with as quickly as possible, because the shortest option, of course, is not to do it at all. The film industry, however, are not skeptical about relentlessly paring things back. William Goldman says that in the film producer's world, there are three kinds of script: too long, and much, much too long. My script fell into the third category. Most of this came down to dialogue. Here's what dialogue looks like in a properly formatted script. As you can see, it's compressed into the middle of the page there. A throwaway conversation, which in a novel only takes a few lines, in proper script format takes half a page and suddenly doesn't look so throwaway. Not only is dialogue expensive in terms of time, but, the producers told me, on screen it feels longer than it is. A conversation that is witty and sparkling on the page is often interminable when you see it in a movie. Films are about stuff happening, they explained. Talking in a cinematic universe is the lowest form of happening. If there's any way to replace the talking with an image, that's what you should be doing. Another problem was the kind of story I was telling. My script mixed comedy with darker material about exploitation and mental illness. In books, this wouldn't necessarily be a problem, but blending genres is frowned upon in filmmaking. People like to know what kind of film they're watching, a rom-com, a thriller, a horror, whatever. If your script doesn't fit into one particular category, that's a problem. The producers thought the comedy elements of the script were stronger, and they had plot changes in mind that would bring the rest of the script into line, which was the right decision, but at the same time it was bracing to have my plot wrested from me and rewritten before my eyes. Most writers will have their work read by an editor, maybe an agent, maybe an assistant or two. In film, everybody involved will give you notes, and everybody says different things. Everybody feels at liberty to rewrite your script in the most fundamental way. For that reason, I found these meetings pretty tough. It was slowly dawning on me that the script no longer belonged to me. I might be the initiator of the script. I might have, not to put too fine a point on it, written all of the script, but that didn't mean I had the final say in the script, or even that I was the authority in the script. With a film, the big decisions are made by whoever's paying for it. I knew this, of course, but it turned out I knew it in the abstract. I was surprised to discover it applied to me. Somehow I thought we'd get a pass. But no, we had to come up with a script that investors would go for. Otherwise, there'd be no film. Simple as that. I was happy enough to cut my dialogue and happy to firm up the genre elements, but other problems arose that were harder to solve, that seemed to come down to a fundamental difference between the way that film saw the world and books see the world. Film is a visual medium, but that doesn't just mean it uses pictures instead of words. Instead, it has an inherent bias towards the visually interesting. That's why there are so many explosions in films compared to books. I would say that of the films I've seen, conservatively about 50% have explosions, because explosions look and sound amazing in films, and if there's any possible reason to put an explosion in, they'll do it. By contrast, explosions feature in very few books, at least books that I've read. It's hard to describe an explosion in words, and you tend to lose most of the impact in the doing. That's a frivolous example, but it also applies to character. Film is not an interior medium. It's not going to be able to show you someone's thought process or explore the depths of their soul in the way that a novel can. There's a lot you can say with a glance, but let's be clear about this, there's also a lot you can't say. Furthermore, there's only so much glancing an audience is willing to put up with. All that means that it's more difficult to represent internal, passive, mopey, conflicted, shy, bookish, wistful, or daydreaming people on screen. Instead, film tilts towards extroverted people doing OTT things. Think of all the films you've seen in which a staid, repressed businessman encounters someone wacky who takes over his life and teaches him to live by crashing his car, bursting into song, or setting his couch on fire. In the filmography of Steve Martin alone, we have Planes, Trains and Automobiles, House Sitter, and Bringing Down the House, with the zany played by John Candy, Goldie Hawn and Queen Latifah, respectively. On screen, extroverts draw the eye and present exciting, colourful images in a way that mopey, droopy types just don't. And behaviour that in real life would seem inconsiderate, attention-seeking, or simply psychotic, in films come across not just as fun and charming, but as engaged with life in a way that we should aspire to. There's surely a thesis to be written on how society has been affected by cinematic championing of the extrovert. For me, it made things very tricky, because Emma, the heroine of my script, was about as introverted and conflicted as you could get. Her apathy was in fact the whole point. Emma's a goth who defines herself in opposition to her glamorous, socially successful sister, Chantal. Emma rejects Chantal's suburban values. She doesn't want to get a job or get a mortgage. She doesn't want to do the things normal people do. She thinks the world outside is basically not for her. In a book, that would all be fine. In literary fiction, embittered outsiders railing at the world from the margins are the equivalent of explosions in films. There's something books do very well. But in the producer's eyes, Emma was too passive. Her mocking, complaining, and resenting was all reactive. Not only were they not charmed by her, they actually preferred her sister, Chantal. Chantal is outgoing and vivacious. She has a job, a boyfriend, a YouTube channel about makeup, and her own car. She enjoys karaoke singing. So lame. But in filmic terms, this all added up to stuff happening on the screen, which engages the viewer, whereas Emma lying on the bed, lying in the bath, or lying on the floor did not. The big change for Emma, what in film they call a precipitating incident, comes when an older man moves in next door. I'll leave aside the long, torturous conversations about how much older he was allowed to be. Dan was the keyboard player in a band that almost made it 10 years before, and he bonds with Emma over music. It's the first time a man has paid attention to her, and not her sister, and Emma is swept off her feet. Dan gets her in a way no one else does. He validates all her resentments. He tells her she's right to think her sister and everyone else she knows are empty, boring people. He promises to take her away from all these assholes, to a world of art and bohemia. Of course, he turns out to be full of shit. And when she comes back to Earth, Emma has to face the possibility that maybe for all of this time, she's been deluding herself, and that she is the asshole, and the people around her are actually okay. The key issue for the producers here was that Dan seduces Emma instead of the other way around. To me, this seemed like the only way a relationship like this could happen. Not only is Emma younger, 17, she's chronically underconfident, has never been kissed, lives at odds with her own body. She's not the kind of person who'd make a move in an older man. At the same time, she's exactly the kind of vulnerable, naive person a certain type of predator might target. Again, if you were telling the story in a book with the girl narrating, this wouldn't be a problem. But the producers thought this was another instance of Emma's passivity, and they wanted to flip it around so that Emma seduced him. At this point, I dug my heels in. I felt like the producers were asking Emma to bring it. At this point, I dug my heels in. I felt like the producers were asking Emma to become exactly the kind of person she complained about, someone who acted, did things, whereas Emma felt, and not uncoincidentally, I felt, that the only reason people did things was because everyone else is doing them, and if people stopped doing things, the world would be in less of a mess. I was probably over-identifying with Emma at this point, but I felt I had to be true to my characters, and seducing Dan just didn't seem the kind of thing she would do. Film people are very good at solving problems quickly. And instead of debating the point with me, this is when the producers brought in the script advisor, a wonderful lady called Rachel Flanagan. If you want to know about how to write a screenplay, I'd strongly recommend you get in touch with her. Her main point was that Emma's passivity wasn't a philosophical issue or a character issue, it was a technical issue. As with the dialogue, it was how things showed up on screen. Films are about stuff happening, and your hero has to be the one doing the stuff. If the hero is just watching the stuff happen, then the stuff comes to the audience from one remove, and they won't engage with the stuff. She put it more eloquently than that. Film presents its heroes as agents of their own personal adventure, with the world rearranging itself as a consequence of their behaviour. And if you don't do it that way, the action will seem slow and the film simply won't work. What we needed to do, Rachel said, was find a way to make Emma's passivity active. For a writer, that's the kind of editorial comment that requires at least 6 months of weeping. But like I say, film people are about solving problems quickly. If it's Emma's story, then in every scene, she's got to be the one driving the action forwards. Everything in a film has to relate to two questions. What does the hero want and what do they need? Every scene has to show them trying to get to their want or their need. Some of Emma's problems came from the fact that I'd written the script first without figuring out the structure. So most of the story was there, but it was lost under the dialogue and other beautiful but unnecessary diversions that I'd spent so long creating. There's a well-known rule of thumb, which I didn't know. A script is 90% architecture, 10% texture. I was an architect who was fixated on texture, who was brilliant at picking out rugs, but whose buildings collapsed when you went inside. It turns out there are very strict rules about film architecture. Films tell stories in a very specific way, and although they don't realize it, audiences expect that template and that way of storytelling, and if you don't give it to them, they won't connect with your film. The way that films tell stories is through what Rachel called sequence tensions. Structurally, a film is usually made up of 7 or 8 discrete sequences. Stanley Kubrick called these submersibles. Each sequence or part or submersible is about 10 to 12 minutes long. Each one revolves around the question of whether the hero will or won't be able to do something. Will Emma get a job? Will the jewel thief track down the safecracker? That's where the dramatic tension comes from. As soon as the question is answered, you're immediately on to the next sequence and the next tension. Each sequence will relate to the overarching question of whether the hero is going to get what she wants. So in Emma's case, what she wants is to run away with a handsome older man and start a band. Is she going to get it? If she doesn't, will she get what she needs, which is to fix her relationship with her sister? Within your 8 sequences, you have your 3 acts. These are divided up in a particular way, and there's various beats you want to hit. There's the inciting incident at the start, then there's the honeymoon moment when everything's seemingly coming together. There's the back to square one moment when it's all fallen apart again, before the resolution that ties everything up. There's a lot more to it, and if you're interested, again, look up Rachel Flanagan, and she'll be able to show you how it all works. But basically, films are incredibly formulaic in a way that books are not. There's a lot of rules to obey, and I did bridle a bit at this. I thought of my heroine, Emma, the problem character, and how much she'd enjoy not following the rules and not fulfilling the audience's expectations of her. But would she want to watch the film of it? She might applaud ignoring the template, but maybe she'd complain that the film was boring. I started looking at Emma through the lens of her wants and needs, and I tried to see what she was doing in each scene to get them, to make that the point of the scene. For the most part, this didn't involve huge changes, more tweaks in perspective. Instead of her friend starting the band, Emma starts the band. When her sister has a car accident, Emma offers to take over her job. Pretty much the same stuff happens, but Emma's more conspicuously the driver of it. It felt formulaic, it was formulaic, but when I finally saw the film, it didn't look formulaic. Instead, the story flowed. There were no boring bits. The characters felt human and relatable, even, especially Emma, while still coming across, thanks to Jordan Jones's performance, as quite a vulnerable, sensitive character. One of the big differences between writing a novel and writing a script, which I sort of knew, but again, on a more fundamental level, sort of didn't, was that the novel is the end product. It's what the reader sees. But watching a film, you don't see the script with its 7 to 8 submersibles. You're not looking at the architecture. You're seeing the texture, which is provided not by you, but by the actors, the cinematography, the production design, and everything else. So working on a script, you're producing something that in itself is going to seem flat, sparse, maybe a bit cliched, because you know that once it's a film, it'll appear completely different, and those flaws will have become strengths. It's hard to pivot to this from writing fiction, where texture is the reason you're doing it. The producers were happier, and so were the film board, and we got the money to make the film. Hugh had already started casting, and soon we were ready to go into production. I say we, but for the screenwriter, that's pretty much the end of your involvement. Sometimes you're asked to stay on during the shoot to make any changes that might be needed, but more often you're asked not to come to the shoot. Sometimes it's even in your contract, because the director doesn't want the actors coming to you instead of him to discuss their motivation. When I imagined writing a script, I saw myself hanging out on set, meeting the actors and bonding with the crew, but instead, literally everybody else goes off to hang out on set, and you start looking for your next job. It's quite alienating, especially because there are so many interesting characters working on the film and so many interesting stories emerge from this shoot. It's a real goldmine for a writer, but unless you manage to direct yourself, you're going to hear about them secondhand. Treasure very kindly allowed me to come along to the set for a couple of the scenes, and from that I got a sense of what a film shoot is like. It's a very tight affair. You spend so much time on the script and the pre-production, then the shoot itself is a mad scramble. Issues arise that you can't do anything about, and the script that you've all worked so hard to get just right ends up getting changed as a result. For instance, some of the cast might only be available for a couple of days, and if their scenes aren't done in the time allotted, they just have to be cut. I put lots of cars and driving in the script, but it turned out that none of the actors could drive, so they had to tweak the scenes to accommodate that. There was an issue with the dog, or maybe more with its handler, that meant the first 5 minutes of the script were simply lost. Also, actors bring their own ideas to the characters, and sometimes lines no longer work, or they want to change them. When the shoot was over, Hugh spent almost a year editing it, and Metal Heart finally appeared in June of 2019, a mere 9 years after we'd serendipitously met in the bar of the Gate Theatre. The first, and indeed the second time I saw it, I mostly noticed the differences between the film and my script. Scenes that had been cut, or lines that had been changed, or intangible but important tonal differences. It wasn't until the third time that I could see it as a film in its own right and appreciate what a great job Hugh had done. It's a very funny, very sweet, very charming film, probably a bit less dark and combative than I would have made it, because Hugh is a nicer person than I am. It was a long and difficult process, but by the end I could appreciate how lucky I was that my first script ended up in the hands of people who were so talented and so committed to bringing out the best parts of the story. By the time I finished the script, I'd been working on it for about 18 months solid, and I wondered how my writing process would be affected. When I returned to fiction, I had 3 different ideas, and I couldn't work out which one to do. So what I did was develop treatments for each of them to show the editor. I didn't stick exactly to the 8 submersible sequence template, but I did plot out all the events from beginning to end. I ended up with 3 highly detailed synopses for 3 possible books, but even though I knew exactly what was going to happen, I realized I hadn't a clue what the books would actually sound or feel like. I didn't know what the voice was, I didn't know who the characters were, which was very disconcerting. By the end of the synopsis, I had no idea, literally none, of what the book would sound or feel like, by which I mean at the most fundamental level, whether it would work or not. Finally, my editor chose what seemed like the shortest, easiest book, and I started to write it. But after about 5 pages, I realized that I wasn't into it. In synopsis, it was great, all kinds of funny scenes and quirky characters, but as a book, I just didn't want to do it. Instead, I found myself writing about one of the minor characters, writing her backstory. I didn't have a plan, but as I wrote, all these other ideas started to come, all these other directions I could go. So I kept going with that, and it felt incredibly liberating. So I guess the big lesson was how much I love writing. Books don't have investors, and for that reason you have so much more freedom than you do as a screenwriter, in terms of length, events, structure, representing interior life in really every conceivable way. Samuel Johnson famously said that no one but a blockhead ever wrote except for money. I don't think that's true when it comes to writing fiction. It may not be lucrative, but artistically it's very fulfilling. I think it is true for someone like me who likes texture when it comes to screenwriting. But if you like architecture, if you're good at structure and plotting things out, if you're happy for your work to be reimagined by someone else, then screenwriting may be for you. But bear in mind that cinema has changed a lot, even since the 1990s. The kinds of films that beguiled me back then are almost impossible to get made in an industry dominated by superhero franchises. In retrospect, I can see that those films, by your Linklaters, your Whit Stillmans, and your Steven Soderberghs, are really more like novels than traditional 3-act movies. And unfortunately, that's not where the money is. So I'll leave you today with a quote from one of the most novelistic of filmmakers, John Cassavetes. Films today show only a dream world and have lost touch with the way people really are. I've never seen an exploding helicopter. I've never seen anybody go and blow somebody's head off. So why should I make films about them? But I have seen people destroy themselves in the smallest way. I've seen people withdraw. I've seen people hide behind political ideas, behind dope, behind the sexual revolution, behind fascism, behind hypocrisy. And I've myself done all these things. Most people don't know what they want or feel. And for everyone, myself included, it's very difficult to say what you mean, and what you mean is painful. The most difficult thing in the world is to reveal yourself, to express what you have to. As an artist, I feel that we must try many things, but above all, we must dare to fail. You must have the courage to be bad, to be willing to risk everything, to really express it all.